One woman, a sea of gang members. Alone, with nothing but her badge and unshakable resolve, a fearless female cop steps into the heart of danger. What unfolds next will leave the entire city stunned and redefine what true courage means. Officer Sarah Collins strode purposefully through the heart of Harborview District, the neighborhood tense with an uneasy stillness. The colorful graffiti on the walls told stories of territory and power, each marking a warning she chose to ignore. Around her, the streets seemed abandoned, but she could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her every move. The basketball court, usually filled with shouts and laughter, stood eerily silent. This wasn't just a patrol, this was a test of resolve. Armed with nothing but her wits, Sarah walked alone toward Cobalt Plaza, where whispers of gang activity had escalated into threats too loud to ignore. Alone in the heart of enemy territory, she prepared for a confrontation that could change everything. The sun dipped behind the crumbling skyline of Harborview, casting long shadows across the graffiti-stained walls and abandoned storefronts. The district had earned its reputation as the city's most dangerous, where the rule of law was nothing more than a suggestion. Yet, as the streets emptied and the air grew thick with an uneasy silence, Officer Sarah Collins stood firm, her badge gleaming in the faint glow of the setting sun. Her breath was steady as she adjusted the strap of her duty belt, the weight of her taser, flashlight and handcuffs familiar but no less heavy. Tonight, she wasn't just another cop on patrol, she was a symbol of defiance in a neighborhood overrun by the iron grip of the Cobalt Kings. The gang operated with near impunity, their influence extending like a virus across the city, corrupting its core. And Cobalt Plaza? It was their fortress. "Are you sure about this?" crackled the voice of her partner Reggie through the radio clipped to her vest. "You're heading straight into the lion's den. You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Sarah." Sarah pressed the button to respond, her voice calm but resolute. "This isn't about proving anything. It's about doing my job. If we don't show up here, Reggie, they win. Harborview doesn't belong to them." The radio went silent for a moment before Reggie's reluctant sigh came through. "Just watch your six." She clipped the radio back and stepped onto the cracked pavement of Cobalt Plaza. The air was thick, almost suffocating, carrying the faint scent of burning rubber and stale cigarettes. The plaza's centerpiece, an old basketball court with sagging hoops, was eerily empty. Normally, this area would buzz with activity. Gang members congregating, deals going down, a community too scared to resist. But tonight, the stillness was deafening. Her every step echoed, bouncing off the crumbling walls. She knew she was being watched. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around, to retreat to the safety of her patrol car, but she didn't flinch. Fear wasn't an option. Not here. Not now. Suddenly, the sharp sound of a bottle breaking shattered the silence. Sarah stopped, her hand instinctively resting on the grip of her taser. Her eyes scanned the darkened alleys that bordered the plaza, her heart pounding against her ribcage. She refused to let it show. They thrived on fear, and she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Marco, the self-proclaimed king of the Cobalt Kings. He was flanked by two of his lieutenants, their faces masked with smug arrogance. Marco's presence was electric, intimidating and commanding. He wore a leather jacket adorned with the gang's insignia, his posture radiating authority. The air around him seemed to vibrate with tension. "Officer Collins," Marco greeted, his voice low and syrupy with mockery. "What an unexpected surprise. You come here alone? That's bold. Or stupid." Sarah held her ground, meeting his gaze without a flicker of hesitation. "Just doing my job, Marco. Something you wouldn't understand." Marco chuckled, the sound cold and hollow. "Your job? Policing a district that doesn't want you? That's rich. Look around, officer. These streets are ours. You're trespassing." Sarah stepped closer, her hand never leaving her taser. "These streets belong to the people who live here, not to you, not to your gang. You're parasites, leeching off their fear." The lieutenants bristled, their hands twitching toward their pockets. Marco raised a hand silencing them. His smirk faded, replaced with a calculated glare. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't keep you alive in Harborview. Turn around, go back to your precinct and pretend you never came here. That's the only warning you'll get." Sarah's voice was steady as she replied, "I don't take orders from criminals. This is your only warning, Marco. The next time we meet, it won't end in a conversation." Marco's eyes narrowed, the threat hanging between them like a blade. For a moment, the plaza seemed to hold its breath, the tension crackling like static. Then, with a flick of his wrist, Marco signaled his men to back off. "Suit yourself, Officer Collins," Marco said, his voice dripping with menace. "But don't say I didn't warn you." As the gang melted back into the shadows, Sarah remained rooted to the spot, her pulse racing. She had made her stand, but she knew this was only the beginning. Harborview wasn't going to be reclaimed overnight, and the path ahead was lined with danger. But Sarah wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person too afraid to take back their neighborhood. She turned and began walking back to her patrol car, her steps measured but unwavering. Above her, the streetlights flickered, casting intermittent light on the cracked streets. The plaza was quiet once more, but Sarah knew that the battle for Harborview had just begun. As she opened her car door, her radio crackled to life again. "You good?" Reggie asked, his voice laced with worry. Sarah took a deep breath before responding. "I'm good, but things are about to get worse." The streets were watching, and so was she. The next morning, Harborview was drenched in a pale mist, the streets damp with the residue of the previous night's confrontation. Officer Sarah Collins sat at her desk in the precinct, staring at the scrawled notes and crime reports scattered before her. The room buzzed with the hum of conversations, the clatter of keyboards and the occasional crackle of a radio, but Sarah was locked in her thoughts. Her encounter with Marco had left an indelible impression. He wasn't just a leader, he was a symbol of the stranglehold the Cobalt Kings had on Harborview. Breaking that grip would require more than arrests. It needed strategy, courage, and most importantly, allies. She tapped her pen against her notebook, the rhythm a poor substitute for clarity. Her partner, Reggie Hayes, plopped into the chair across from her. A seasoned officer with a penchant for gallows humor, Reggie had seen enough of Harborview's worst to earn the right to his cynicism. But today, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. "Word on the street is Marco's not taking last night lightly," Reggie said, his tone low. "You made a statement, Sarah, but you also made yourself a target." Sarah shrugged, flipping through her notes. "I didn't expect them to send me a thank you card. If anything, it confirms we're getting under their skin." Reggie leaned forward, his voice dropping even further. "Getting under their skin is one thing. Starting a war is another. You need to be smart about this. Marco doesn't bluff." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "I'm not bluffing either, Reggie. The Cobalt Kings think they own Harborview, but they don't. We have to remind them of that." Reggie sighed, running a hand over his face. "Then we need a plan. A real one. Because right now, they're regrouping, and we can't just patrol the streets hoping they'll screw up." Before Sarah could respond, Captain Ramirez entered the bullpen. Her sharp gaze scanned the room before landing on Sarah and Reggie. Ramirez was a no-nonsense leader with an unyielding commitment to the badge. She motioned them into her office, her expression unreadable. Inside, Ramirez shut the door and crossed her arms. "I heard about your little showdown with Marco last night," she began, her tone clipped. "Care to explain why you went into Cobalt Plaza alone?" Sarah stood tall. "Because someone had to. If we don't show up, they take it as a victory. We can't let them think we're afraid." Ramirez studied her, her eyes narrowing. "You're right, but you also took a risk, a big one. This precinct can't afford to lose you, Collins. You're one of the best we've got, but I need you to work smarter, not harder." Reggie chimed in. "She's right, Cap. We need more than just presence. We need intel, strategy, leverage." Ramirez nodded. "And that's why I called you in. We've got a lead, someone willing to talk. A girl named Maya. She's been on the edges of the Cobalt Kings for months, keeping a low profile. But now, she wants out." Sarah's interest piqued. "Why now?" Ramirez handed her a file. She says Marco's planning something big, something that could escalate their power beyond Harborview. She's scared, but she's willing to meet, under certain conditions. What conditions? Reggie asked, skeptical. She wants protection, Ramirez said. She won't go on record unless we guarantee her safety. Sarah glanced at the file, her mind racing. Where's the meet? Neutral ground, Ramirez replied. The old textile mill on Harborview's edge, tonight at 8. You and Reggie will handle it. Reggie sighed. The textile mill. Great. Nothing ever goes wrong in abandoned buildings. Sarah ignored him, focusing on Ramirez. We'll get her out safely. If she has what we need, this could be the break we've been waiting for. Ramirez nodded. Just be careful. Marco doesn't like loose ends. As night fell, Sarah and Reggie arrived at the mill. The building loomed like a ghostly skeleton, its windows shattered, its walls covered in decades-old graffiti. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Sarah's flashlight cut through the darkness as they navigated the debris-strewn floor. This place screams ambush, Reggie muttered, his hand resting on his holster. Stay sharp, Sarah replied, her eyes scanning every shadow. A faint shuffling noise drew their attention to a corner of the room. Maya emerged, her figure small and trembling in the dim light. She looked no older than 20, her face pale with fear, her eyes darting around as if expecting Marco's men to materialize at any moment. "You're the cops?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah stepped forward, her tone soft but firm. "I'm Officer Collins, and this is Officer Hayes. You're safe now, Maya. Let's talk." Maya hesitated before stepping closer. "Marco's planning something big," she began, her voice shaking. "He's not just controlling Harborview anymore. He's bringing in people, new recruits, new weapons. He wants to expand." "Expand where?" Reggie asked. "Everywhere," Maya said, her voice breaking. "He's tired of just owning Harborview. He wants the whole city." Sarah exchanged a glance with Reggie, the gravity of Maya's words settling over them like a storm cloud. "Why are you telling us this now?" Sarah asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Because I can't do it anymore," Maya whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I've seen what they do to people who cross them, and I know too much. If I stay, I'm dead." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on Maya's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing. We'll keep you safe." A sudden noise, metal scraping against concrete, sent a jolt through all three of them. Sarah drew her weapon, her heart pounding. "Reggie, cover the entrance." From the darkness, voices echoed, growing louder. Marco's men. They had been followed. "You said this place was secure," Reggie hissed, his weapon drawn. "No time for that," Sarah snapped. "Maya, stay low. We'll get you out." The tension in the mill thickened as footsteps closed in, the shadows coming alive with danger. Sarah gripped her weapon, her mind racing. This wasn't just a meeting anymore, it was a fight for survival. And the night was far from over. The metallic echoes of approaching footsteps reverberated through the cavernous textile mill. The shadows along the wall seemed to stretch and shift, mocking the safety Sarah had promised Maya. She could feel Maya trembling behind her as she kept her weapon raised, her heart beating in sync with the ominous rhythm of the intruder's movements. Reggie crouched behind a rusting support beam near the entrance, his gun drawn and ready. "We've got company," he said through gritted teeth, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay calm," Sarah replied, scanning the room for cover. "We'll get through this." The faint glint of a flashlight beam swept across the far wall, followed by the low murmur of voices. Sarah counted at least 3 distinct tones. Not Marco himself, but his men. Enforcers sent to clean up loose ends. "They're here for me," Maya whimpered, her voice a shaky whisper. "No," Sarah said firmly, her eyes fixed on the approaching lights. "They're here to make a point, but we're not going to let that happen." The first man appeared in the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the dim light from the street lamps outside. He was broad-shouldered, his posture exuding menace. Behind him, 2 others flanked the entrance, their shadows creeping ahead like predators on the hunt. One of them called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Hey, we know you're in here. Just hand over the girl and we'll make this quick. Sarah's grip on her weapon tightened. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. That's not happening, she said, her voice carrying a defiant edge. Walk away now, and nobody gets hurt. A burst of laughter echoed from the leader. That's cute, lady, but we're not leaving without her. Marco wants her back. Reggie muttered under his breath. They're not leaving without a fight. Then we make sure they regret coming, Sarah replied. The leader motioned to his men, who began fanning out, their footsteps crunching against the debris-littered floor. The beam of a flashlight swept dangerously close to Sarah's position, forcing her to duck behind a stack of rusted crates. Reggie moved silently, taking up a position behind a concrete pillar. Sarah whispered into her radio, "Reggie, on my count, draw their fire. I'll flank them." "Copy that," Reggie replied, his voice tense but steady. The men advanced, their movements slow and deliberate. One of them kicked over an old metal barrel, the noise reverberating like a gunshot. Sarah watched, her adrenaline spiking as she waited for the right moment. "Now!" she hissed. Reggie stepped out from his cover, firing 2 warning shots into the air. "Police, drop your weapons and get on the ground!" The response was immediate. 2 of the men swung their flashlights toward Reggie's position, their guns drawn. Sarah used the distraction to move swiftly, circling around behind the crates and emerging at a new angle. Her weapon was steady as she aimed at the leader. "Drop it!" she shouted. The leader froze for a moment, then smirked. "You're gutsy, I'll give you that." He raised his gun, but Sarah was faster. She fired a shot, hitting the ground near his feet. The ricochet sent sparks flying, forcing him to stumble back. "I said, drop it," she repeated, her voice sharp with authority. Behind her, Maya let out a startled cry as one of the other men lunged toward her. Reggie fired, his bullet grazing the man's shoulder and sending him sprawling. The third man bolted for the exit, clearly realizing he was outmatched, leaving his comrades behind. The leader sneered, dropping his weapon to the floor with a clatter. "You think this changes anything?" he growled. "Marco will never stop." Sarah ignored his threat, her focus on securing the scene. "Reggie, cover him," she ordered, moving to Maya. The girl was pale and shaken, but unhurt. "You okay?" Maya nodded, though tears streaked her face. "You shouldn't have come for me. Now they'll come for you too." Sarah knelt beside her, gripping her shoulder firmly. "Let them. We're not scared of Marco, but you're not going back to him. Not tonight. Not ever." Within minutes, backup arrived, sirens cutting through the night as police cars surrounded the mill. The remaining gang members were taken into custody, their bravado replaced with quiet anger. Captain Ramirez stepped out of her car, her expression both relieved and frustrated. "Collins, you just can't stay out of trouble, can you?" Sarah shrugged, exhausted but resolute. "Trouble tends to find me, Captain." Ramirez glanced at Maya, then back at Sarah. "She better be worth it. You've just stirred up a hornet's nest." "She's worth it," Sarah said firmly. "She's scared, but she's brave, and she has the information we need." Ramirez nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Get her back to the precinct. We'll debrief in the morning. And Collins?" Sarah paused. "Yes, Captain." "Good work tonight, but don't push your luck." Back at the precinct, Maya sat in an interrogation room, sipping on a cup of tea Reggie had scrounged up. Her hands still shook as she recounted everything she knew. Sarah listened intently, taking notes as Maya described Marco's growing ambitions. "He's bringing in people from other cities," Maya said. "He's meeting with suppliers, guns, drugs, everything. He wants to be untouchable." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Do you know when these meetings are happening?" Maya hesitated, her eyes darting to the mirrored glass. "Tomorrow night. At the docks. But he'll have guards everywhere. You won't stand a chance." Sarah exchanged a glance with Reggie. "We don't need to take him down tomorrow. We just need enough to start unraveling his operation." Reggie frowned. "You're talking about surveillance. That's risky, Sarah. If they catch us, we're done." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes burning with determination. "We don't have a choice. If Marco consolidates power, Harborview is done. We need to act now." Maya reached for Sarah's hand, her voice trembling. "If you do this, you need to be careful. Marco doesn't just destroy his enemies. He makes them examples." Sarah squeezed Maya's hand. I'm not afraid of Marco. He doesn't own this city, and we're going to prove it." As the first light of dawn crept through the precinct windows, Sarah knew the real battle was just beginning. Marco had made his move, and now it was her turn. The morning sun bathed Harborview in a deceptive calm, casting long shadows over a city still reeling from the tension of the previous night. At the precinct, the air buzzed with activity as Sarah Collins sat in the briefing room, staring at the tactical map laid out on the table. Marked in red were the docks, Marco's chosen stronghold, the site of his anticipated meeting. Reggie entered, holding 2 cups of coffee, and set one in front of her. "You look like you haven't slept," he said, sliding into the seat next to her. "I haven't," Sarah replied, her eyes still fixed on the map. "This meeting tonight, it's our chance. If we don't act now, Marco's network will solidify. After that, getting to him will be nearly impossible." Reggie took a sip of his coffee, his expression grim. "You know this won't be easy. He'll have lookouts, weapons, and plenty of muscle." Sarah nodded. "I know. That's why we're not going in blind." She stood, turning to address the room where her team had gathered. "Listen up, everyone. Tonight's operation isn't about taking down Marco. It's about gathering intel. We observe, document, and retreat. No heroics, no direct confrontation unless absolutely necessary." Captain Ramirez, standing near the doorway, added, "Collins is right. We can't afford to lose anyone tonight. Marco's been a ghost for too long. This is our chance to pull back the curtain." The team murmured their agreement, their faces a mixture of determination and apprehension. They knew the stakes. As twilight descended over Harborview, Sarah's team positioned themselves strategically around the docks. The salty air was thick with tension, the sound of waves lapping against the hulls of moored ships providing an eerie soundtrack. Sarah and Reggie crouched behind a stack of rusting shipping containers, their binoculars trained on a dilapidated warehouse at the edge of the pier. A steady stream of men filed inside, their movements deliberate and organized. "That's Marco's inner circle," Reggie whispered. "This isn't just a deal, it's a summit." Sarah nodded, her pulse quickening. "They're consolidating power. He's bringing in the out-of-towners to solidify alliances." Her earpiece crackled to life. "Team 3, in position," came the voice of Officer Malik from the far side of the dockyard. "Hold your positions," Sarah instructed. "No one moves until we have everything we need." Inside the warehouse, the meeting was heating up. Through her binoculars, Sarah spotted Marco at the center of the gathering, his presence commanding. He gestured animatedly as he spoke, his voice too muffled to hear, but his intent clear. "He's rallying them," Sarah murmured. "This is bigger than we thought." Suddenly, a flash of movement caught her eye. A man near the warehouse entrance raised his hand, pointing directly in their direction. "Reggie," Sarah hissed, "we've been made." Chaos erupted as Marco's guards fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Sarah grabbed her radio. "All teams, fall back. We've been compromised. Regroup at the extraction point." Reggie fired a warning shot into the air, buying them a few precious seconds as they sprinted toward the exit. Behind them, the sound of heavy boots and shouted orders echoed ominously. "This way!" Sarah barked, leading Reggie through a labyrinth of stacked containers. Her mind raced as she assessed their options. The extraction point was on the far side of the docks, but reaching it meant crossing open ground. A death sentence if the gang's sharpshooters were in position. Ahead, a towering crane loomed over the dockyard, its skeletal frame offering a potential escape route. "Up there!" Sarah shouted, gesturing to the ladder. Reggie hesitated, glancing back at their pursuers. "You sure about this?" "It's our only shot," Sarah replied, already climbing. Reggie followed, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. As they ascended, gunshots rang out, the bullets sparking off the metal rungs. Sarah's heart pounded as she reached the top, pulling herself onto the narrow platform. Below, their pursuers fanned out, searching the shadows. Reggie crouched beside her, his face pale. "Now what?" Sarah scanned the area, her eyes landing on a cargo ship moored nearby. "We jump." Reggie's eyes widened. "You're insane." "Do you have a better idea?" Sarah retorted. Without waiting for an answer, she climbed onto the railing, bracing herself for the leap. The cold shock of the water stole Sarah's breath as she hit the surface, the salty brine stinging her eyes. She surfaced quickly, glancing back to see Reggie splash down beside her. "Swim!" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the waves. They reached the ship's hull and clung to the anchor chain, gasping for air. Above, the gang's flashlights swept the water, but the waves provided enough cover to keep them hidden. "We're not out of this yet," Reggie said, his voice trembling with exertion. "No," Sarah agreed, her mind already racing to plan their next move. "But we've got what we came for. Marco's plans are bigger than we thought. Now we know where to hit him." Hours later, back at the precinct, Sarah and Reggie debriefed Captain Ramirez. The operation had been a partial success. They had gathered enough intel to confirm Marco's alliances and plans, but the escape had cost them dearly. 2 officers were injured, and the gang was now on high alert. "We can't keep playing defense," Sarah said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We need to take the fight to Marco. End this." Ramirez leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "You're right, Collins, but we need to be smart about it. One wrong move, and we're finished." As Sarah left the captain's office, the weight of the night's events pressed heavily on her. Harborview was teetering on the edge, and the battle ahead promised to be the most dangerous yet. But Sarah was ready. She had to be. For Maya, for the city, for everyone who couldn't fight back. The storm was coming, and Sarah Collins was determined to face it head-on. The rain lashed against the windows of the precinct, each drop like a ticking clock counting down to the inevitable showdown. Sarah Collins sat in the operations room, her gaze fixed on the tactical board filled with photos, maps, and hastily scrawled notes. Every piece of intel gathered from the previous night pointed to one conclusion. Marco was planning something catastrophic. Reggie entered, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. He set it down beside her without a word, knowing that no amount of caffeine could steady the storm brewing inside her. "They're doubling down," he finally said. "Intel says Marco's bringing in reinforcements from out of town. If we don't act soon—" "They'll own the city," Sarah finished, her voice a low growl. "We're out of time." Captain Ramirez entered, her presence commanding attention. "Collins, we've just received a tip from one of Maya's contacts. Marco's hosting a weapons shipment at an abandoned factory on Birch Street tonight. If we move fast, we can intercept it." Sarah's jaw tightened. "It's a trap. Marco wants us to come. He's baiting us." "Probably," Ramirez admitted, "but it's also our best shot to catch him off guard. Are you in?" Sarah nodded without hesitation. "Always." By nightfall, the team was ready. Tactical gear in place, Sarah briefed her officers one last time. The factory loomed in the distance, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the glow of distant city lights. This wasn't just a raid. It was a calculated gamble with lives on the line. "Our goal is clear," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension. "We disrupt the shipment, neutralize Marco's men, and get out alive. No unnecessary risks. Stick to your training." As the team moved into position, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the lion's den. Every instinct screamed at her to be cautious, but the weight of Harborview's safety pushed her forward. Reggie tapped her shoulder. "We're ready." "Let's go," Sarah whispered. The team infiltrated the factory with precision, their movements silent and calculated. The sound of dripping water echoed through the cavernous space, mingling with the faint hum of generators. Crates lined the walls, marked with Cyrillic lettering that hinted at the deadly cargo within. Suddenly, the lights snapped on, blinding the officers. A cacophony of shouts erupted as armed gang members flooded the factory floor, their weapons trained on the intruders. Marco's voice boomed from above, his figure perched on a metal catwalk. "Welcome, Officer Collins," he called out, his tone dripping with mockery. "I was hoping you'd accept my invitation." Sarah's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "It's over, Marco. Surrender now, and this doesn't have to end in bloodshed." Marco laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You still think you can outplay me? This city is mine. You're just a guest." He raised his hand, signaling his men. The first shots rang out, and chaos erupted. Sarah dove for cover as bullets ricocheted off the concrete floor. Reggie and the others returned fire, their training keeping them alive in the pandemonium. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the sound of shouts and gunfire. "Move to the west exit," Sarah shouted into her radio, her voice cutting through the noise. "We're sitting ducks here." Reggie covered her as she darted toward a stack of crates, her mind racing for a way to turn the tide. Through the chaos, she spotted a line of propane tanks near the far wall, a potential equalizer if they could reach it. "Reggie, give me cover fire," she ordered. Without waiting for a response, she broke cover, sprinting toward the tanks. The gang's focus shifted to her, bullets peppering the ground at her heels. Sarah reached the tanks and fired a single, precise shot, igniting a chain reaction that sent flames roaring through the factory. The explosion bought them precious seconds as Marco's men scrambled to regain control. Through the smoke and flames, Sarah saw Marco retreating toward a side door, flanked by two of his guards. "He's getting away!" she shouted, breaking into a sprint. Reggie called after her, "Sarah, wait! It's too dangerous!" She ignored him, her focus laser-sharp. Marco had eluded justice for too long, and she wasn't about to let him slip away again. Bursting through the door, Sarah found herself in a narrow alleyway. Marco was already climbing into a black SUV, his guards firing at her as they covered his escape. She dropped to one knee, firing back with precision. One guard fell, but the SUV roared to life, its tires screeching as it sped into the night. Breathing heavily, Sarah stood in the rain-soaked alley, her fists clenched in frustration. Marco had slipped through her fingers, but she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Back at the precinct, the team regrouped, their faces etched with exhaustion and disappointment. The operation had dealt a significant blow to Marco's network. The shipment was destroyed and several of his men were in custody, but the kingpin himself had escaped. "We'll get him," Reggie said, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "This isn't over." Sarah nodded, though her expression was grim. "No, it's not. But we're closer than we've ever been. Marco's on the run now. We just have to keep the pressure on." Captain Ramirez entered, her expression a mix of relief and resolve. "Collins, your instincts were right tonight. We disrupted his plans, and that's a victory. But the fight isn't over. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we strategize." As Sarah left the precinct, the weight of the night's events pressed heavily on her. Harborview was still in danger, but tonight had proven one thing. Marco wasn't invincible. The cracks in his empire were showing, and Sarah was determined to widen them. She stepped out into the rain, her resolve unshaken. The storm had only just begun, and she was ready for whatever came next. The sun rose reluctantly over Harborview, casting an uneasy light on a city teetering on the edge of chaos. Marco's escape the night before had left Sarah with an ache of unfinished business, but she knew the gang leader wouldn't stay hidden for long. If there was one thing Marco couldn't resist, it was retaliation. By midday, Sarah's prediction came true. A call came through the precinct radio, cutting through the usual hum of activity. "This is dispatch. We have reports of a fire at the Harborview Community Center. Multiple witnesses claim it's gang-related." Sarah bolted from her desk. The community center wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of hope for the neighborhood, a place where kids could play safely and families could gather. It was also where Sarah had held countless outreach sessions to bridge the gap between the police and the people they served. "Reggie, you're with me," Sarah barked, grabbing her jacket and keys. Within seconds, they were in her patrol car, sirens blaring as they sped toward the thick plume of smoke rising in the distance. The scene was chaos when they arrived. Flames engulfed the building, roaring as firefighters battled to control the blaze. A crowd had gathered, their faces painted with fear and anger. Sarah pushed through the crowd, scanning for familiar faces. "Has everyone made it out?" she shouted over the din. One of the firefighters, his face smeared with soot, nodded grimly. "We think so, but this fire was no accident. Someone wanted to send a message." Reggie pointed to the side of the building, where a crude symbol was spray-painted in black, a crown surrounded by flames. The mark of the Cobalt Kings. Sarah's chest tightened. This wasn't just retaliation, it was Marco's way of letting the city know he was still in control. She turned to Reggie, her voice sharp. "We need to find Marco before he escalates further." Back at the precinct, Sarah convened a meeting with her team. The air in the room was heavy with tension as they pieced together what they knew. Marco had been spotted at several locations around the city, each one tied to his gang's operations, but he was always one step ahead, vanishing before officers could close in. Maya, their informant, arrived with fresh intel. She looked more nervous than usual, her hands fidgeting as she spoke. "Marco's angry. He thinks someone in his inner circle betrayed him after last night. He's rounding up his men at an old warehouse on the docks. If you act fast, you can catch him there." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "How reliable is this information, Maya? If it's another trap—" Maya's voice faltered. "It's reliable, but you'll need to move quickly. He's planning to leave the city after tonight." Sarah stood, her determination evident. "Then we don't wait. Gear up, everyone. We hit the docks tonight." The sun dipped below the horizon as Sarah's team surrounded the warehouse. The docks were eerily quiet, the sound of waves lapping against the pier, the only noise breaking the silence. Sarah's heart pounded as she signaled her team to move in. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of salt and rust. Marco's men were gathered in small groups, their voices low as they discussed their leader's plans. At the center of it all was Marco, his imposing figure a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Sarah's voice echoed through the warehouse as she stepped into view, her weapon drawn. "Marco, it's over. Surrender now, and this ends peacefully." Marco's men spun toward her, their weapons at the ready, but Marco held up a hand, his expression twisted into a smug grin. "Collins, you just can't stay away, can you?" "You've pushed this city to the brink," Sarah said, her voice steady. "It ends tonight." Marco laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "You think you've won because you burned a shipment and rounded up a few of my men? You have no idea what's coming." Before Sarah could respond, a deafening explosion rocked the warehouse, sending her and her team sprawling to the ground. Marco's men scattered, the smoke and chaos giving them cover to escape. Sarah coughed, her ears ringing as she struggled to her feet. Through the haze, she saw Marco slipping out a side door, flanked by his most loyal men. "Reggie, with me!" she shouted, sprinting after them. The chase led them through the maze of shipping containers outside the warehouse, the darkness making every shadow a potential threat. Sarah could hear Marco's men shouting orders, their footsteps echoing as they tried to outmaneuver her. As they rounded a corner, Sarah spotted Marco climbing onto a waiting speedboat. Without hesitation, she raised her weapon, aiming for the boat's engine. Her shot rang out, and the engine sputtered, smoke rising as it stalled. Marco turned, his face contorted with rage. "You just don't know when to quit, do you, Collins?" "You're not leaving," Sarah said, her voice firm. "It's over." Marco raised his hands, feigning surrender. But as Sarah approached, he lunged, a knife flashing in his hand. The two struggled, their fight illuminated by the faint glow of the city in the distance. Reggie arrived just in time, tackling Marco to the ground. Together, they subdued him, handcuffing him as backup officers arrived to secure the scene. Marco sneered as he was hauled to his feet. "You think this changes anything? Another will take my place. The Cobalt Kings aren't going anywhere." Sarah stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. "You're wrong. This city is tired of living in fear. Your reign is over." As dawn broke over Harborview, Sarah stood on the pier, watching as Marco was loaded into a squad car. The weight of the past few weeks pressed heavily on her, but there was also a sense of relief. The battle wasn't over, but tonight, the city had won a decisive victory. Reggie joined her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "You did it, Sarah. Marco's out of the game." "We did it," Sarah corrected, a small smile breaking through, "and we're just getting started." As they left the docks, the first rays of sunlight illuminated the city, signaling a new beginning. Harborview still had scars, but for the first time in years, there was hope. Harborview was different now. The scars left by Marco and the Cobalt Kings ran deep, but so did the resolve of its people. The takedown of Marco and his network marked the beginning of a new era for the city, a turning point Sarah Collins had fought tirelessly to achieve. Months after the operation at the docks, the city felt alive again. The streets that once echoed with fear now hummed with the sounds of children playing and neighbors reconnecting. Businesses reopened, graffiti murals became art projects, and the community center, rebuilt with the help of local volunteers, stood as a beacon of resilience. Officer Sarah Collins became a local hero, but she refused to take all the credit. At a ceremony honoring her bravery, she stood at the podium, her uniform pressed and her heart full. "This honor isn't mine alone," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "It belongs to every officer who stood beside me, every informant who risked their safety, and every resident of Harborview who believed in a better tomorrow. Together, we proved that change is possible when we stand united." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the plaza. Among them were familiar faces: Mrs. Chen, Maya, Reggie, and countless others who had been touched by Sarah's work. Even as the applause faded, Sarah knew her work wasn't over. She had seen firsthand how crime thrived on desperation, and she was determined to address the root causes that had allowed gangs like the Cobalt Kings to rise in the first place. With the support of the precinct and the city council, Sarah spearheaded new community initiatives. Job training programs, youth mentorships, and increased funding for local schools became the foundation of Harborview's transformation. These efforts weren't quick fixes, but they planted the seeds of lasting change. One evening, as the city basked in the golden light of sunset, Sarah found herself walking through the neighborhood that had once been Marco's stronghold. Children played basketball on a court once tagged with gang symbols, now repainted with vibrant murals celebrating Harborview's spirit. Mrs. Chen waved from her shop, her smile warm and full of gratitude. Reggie joined Sarah, handing her a coffee as they leaned against the patrol car. "You ever think about how far we've come?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. Sarah smiled, her gaze fixed on the bustling streets. "Every day," she replied, "and it reminds me of how much more we can do." Reggie nodded. "So, what's next?" Sarah's smile widened. "Whatever it takes." As the stars began to twinkle over Harborview, the city felt lighter, freer. The battle against crime wasn't over, but its people no longer lived in fear. They stood together, inspired by the courage of one woman who refused to back down. Sarah Collins had done more than take down a gang. She had reignited hope in a city that had nearly forgotten it. Harborview's story was far from over, but its future was finally in the hands of those who believed in it most, and that made all the difference. Thank you for watching. If you were inspired by Officer Sarah Collins' story of courage and determination, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Share this video with your friends and family to spread the message of resilience and hope. And let us know in the comments, what would you do to stand up for justice? We'd love to hear your thoughts. See you in the next video.